There's often a lot of confusion over the term transgender and other gender identity terms and what they mean. So let's have a quick primer on some key terminology. Alright, so before we jump into the rest of the video, I just want to do a quick shout out to all our Patreon supporters for the month of June. So Tipsy and I send a big loving thank you to Ashav Yahoo, Vanessa, Riley, Zoe, Sammy, Joy, Jesse, Maddie, Maya, Tara, Bia, Tori, Ember, and Melody. Thank you so much for your support and your continued support. For those of you that haven't checked it out yet, be sure to go down to the description and you can find a link to my Patreon. Without further ado, let's get back to the video. So it's important to note that terminology used to describe gender identity, sexuality, just any aspects of identity in general is constantly changing and evolving. So some of the things I talk about will likely become outdated at some point, and please comment below if anything is outdated by the time you end up watching this video. So let's start off with the basics. The term transgender, of course. We can break this down into trans and gender. The prefix trans means across, on the other side of, beyond, or through, and this is tied to the word gender. So essentially transgender, sometimes abbreviated as trans, means someone who has a gender identity that is different from or across from the gender and sex they were assigned at birth. So for example, I was assigned male at birth, but I identify as a woman. Therefore, my gender identity, a transgender woman, is across, beyond, or just simply different from what was expected of me based on my sex being assigned male at birth. Now, what do we use for people who are not transgender? You may have also heard the term cisgender. The prefix cis, C-I-S, means on the same side as, compared to trans, which means on the other side of. In the context of gender, then, cisgender simply means someone who has a gender identity that aligns with or is on the same side as their gender and sex assigned at birth. So for example, someone who identifies as a woman and was assigned female at birth would likely be labeled as a cisgender woman. Her gender identity, again, is on the same side as her sex. It's important to use the term cisgender rather than saying someone is a real or normal man or woman, because such terminology can be othering and even offensive to trans people. Trans people are just as valid as cis people, and using the term cisgender helps demonstrate that cisgender and transgender are simply different ways of relating to gender. They're simply different, and one is not better than the other. Now, when we're talking about gender identity, we also need to talk about non-binary people. Non-binary is a fairly recent term and often encompasses numerous gender identities. It is typically used to refer to people who identify outside of the man-woman gender binary, or this system that we have in the United States and many other cultures where we assume that everyone identifies as either a man or a woman. A binary gender system because there's only two options that society typically tells us that we can inhabit. This could include people who identify as a third gender beyond man or woman, people who do not have a gender identity, people who identify as both a man and a woman, people who have a fluidity of their gender, so like sometimes identifying as a man, sometimes as a woman, or some other gender identity, and so on. The non-binary umbrella often includes identities like genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, neutral, third gender, bigender, pangender, and more. It's super important to note that being non-binary does not automatically means that someone is also transgender. Some non-binary people do identify as transgender, so they're trans and non-binary. But there are some non-binary people who do not identify with that term, do not want to be grouped under the term of trans, because it just doesn't fit how they identify and how they describe themselves. So it's important to just be clear on the terms that somebody does or does not want to use when talking about them. Now, what about this thing called gender transition? You've probably heard transitioning, or I've transitioned, things like that. Broadly speaking, this is the process that a trans or non-binary person takes to live as their affirmed gender. So for me, it's all the steps I went through to live my life as a woman. This may include social transition steps like changing the clothes and accessories that you wear, changing your name, which may be illegally changing your name, or just telling friends, family, coworkers, and so on to just refer to you as a different name. And it may also include going by different gender pronouns. Like for me, as somebody who was assigned male at birth, people used he and him to refer to me throughout a lot of my life. But then when I transitioned and came out as a woman, I started using she, her pronouns. And transition may also include medical transition steps. Trans women and feminine non-binary people may pursue things like vaginoplasty or breast augmentation, and trans men and masculine non-binary people may pursue things like phalloplasty or a mastectomy. Some trans and non-binary people may only pursue social transition steps. Some may only pursue medical transition steps. And many do pursue both social and medical transition steps. But it's important to note that there is no one correct or right path for transition. You know, for each individual trans and non-binary person, it's up to them to find like what steps fit who they are, how they want to identify, how they want to see themselves, and how they want the world to see them. And that looks slightly different or very different from person to person. Regardless of the steps somebody does or doesn't take, all trans and non-binary people are valid in how they identify. And like I mentioned, trans and non-binary people identify with gender identities that are different from their sexes assigned at birth. And because of this, many, not all, but many do experience significant distress or discomfort known as gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria is really just, again, that discomfort between having a gender identity that doesn't align with your sex assigned at birth and being treated in ways that maybe don't affirm your affirmed gender. Gender dysphoria may be related to your physical body, like not matching how you eternally identify, known as body dysphoria. And then social dysphoria could occur when a trans or non-binary person is misgendered. Somebody uses the wrong pronouns. Or if they're dead named, which is using someone's birth name rather than the name they currently go by. Or they're otherwise invalidated or oppressed in social interactions. Social and medical transition, along with finding support, whether that's from like friends, family, coworkers, therapists. These things are some of the most common ways that many trans and non-binary people try to reduce their experiences of gender dysphoria. But like I said, not all trans and non-binary people experience gender dysphoria because not all experience discomfort related to identifying as a gender identity different than their sex assigned at birth. Many do experience that discomfort, which often leads to transition, but it's not required to be trans or non-binary. And one of the reasons for that is because many trans and non-binary people also experience intense positive emotions, known as gender euphoria, which is often a sense of elation or joy associated with feeling and being affirmed in who you are. So that sense of elation can come from yourself, it can come from others, and, you know, somebody who doesn't have gender dysphoria, they may feel just very neutral about their gender and sex assigned at birth, but then they may find identifying as a different gender identity brings them gender euphoria. So it goes from neutral or no dysphoria to very positive emotions. So there's still that increase in euphoria. So euphoria is an important thing to look at. The positive experience and the negative experiences of gender dysphoria are both important to look at. And I bring this up because a lot of times people only focus on the negative. I know I tried to pack a lot in a short period of time, but just consider this a very brief primer on the term transgender and some other related gender identity terms. Be sure to check out any of my other videos on these topics, and let me know if you want me to dive deeper into anything that I brought up, and do that in a future video. Now I turn it over to you. What are your thoughts on the terminology I discussed here? Did you learn anything new? Do you personally identify with any of these terms? For allies out there, what do you do to support the trans and non-binary people in your life? Let me know all of this and more down in the comments below. And as always, Tipsy and I love you all and hope you're staying safe and sound. If you have not done so already, please be sure to give this a huge thumbs up and hit that subscribe button and notification bell. I love you all. Bye for now.